The story begins on a quiet Wednesday afternoon in downtown Oakland. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city streets as Michael, a 16-year-old high school student, stood at the bus stop checking the time on his phone. He had just finished another successful practice with his school's chess club, where he'd been preparing for the upcoming state championship. Michael wasn't just any student, he was the kind of kid who made his parents proud. His backpack was heavy with advanced placement textbooks, and his phone was full of reminder apps, helping him juggle his busy schedule of studying, chess club, and volunteer work at the local community center. He wore his school's dark blue jacket with the chess club logo, neat jeans, and his favorite pair of sneakers his grandmother had given him for his birthday. While waiting for the bus that would take him home, Michael scrolled through his chess app, reviewing the strategies he'd practiced earlier. The street was relatively quiet, with just a few people walking by, some heading home from work, others walking their dogs or chatting with friends. It was the kind of normal, peaceful evening that nobody would expect to turn into something completely different. That's when the police cruiser slowly pulled up to the curb. Officer Richard Barrett had been patrolling the area for about 6 hours now. His shift was almost over, but something caught his eye, or at least, that's what he would claim later in his report. The cruiser's lights weren't on, but its engine hummed quietly as it came to a stop near the bus stop. Michael noticed the police car but didn't think much of it at first. He'd been raised to respect law enforcement, and his parents had always taught him to be polite and cooperative with police officers. He even had a cousin who worked as a deputy in another state. So when Officer Barrett stepped out of his car, Michael simply offered a polite smile and a small nod, the way he'd been taught. But something was off about Officer Barrett's approach. His hand was already resting on his belt as he walked toward Michael, his face set in a stern expression that didn't match the peaceful evening scene. "Hey you," he called out, his voice carrying an edge that made nearby pedestrians turn their heads. "Let me see some ID." Michael felt his heart rate pick up, but he kept his composure. "Good evening, officer," he said clearly, reaching for his school ID in his back pocket. "I'm just waiting for the bus to head home from chess club practice." Officer Barrett's expression didn't change. "Put your hands where I can see them," he ordered, ignoring Michael's explanation. "Turn around and face the wall." By now, people had stopped to watch. A woman walking her dog had pulled out her phone and started recording. A couple of construction workers across the street paused their cleanup to observe the scene. Michael's mind raced, but he remembered his parents' advice. Stay calm, be respectful, but also know your rights. "Officer," Michael said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I'm happy to show you my ID, but could you please tell me what this is about? I haven't done anything wrong." He kept his hands visible, just as he'd been taught, but he also stood his ground with quiet dignity. That's when things escalated quickly. Officer Barrett stepped closer, his hand now firmly gripping his belt. "I said turn around. We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area, and you match a description." Michael felt a chill run down his spine. The description. He was wearing his school jacket with the chess club logo clearly visible. He had his backpack full of books. He was standing at a public bus stop, but he knew arguing these points might make things worse. "Sir, I'd like to call my parents," Michael said calmly, though his voice trembled slightly. "I know my rights and I'd like to." He didn't get to finish his sentence. Officer Barrett suddenly grabbed his arm, spinning him around. The phone fell from Michael's hand, clattering on the sidewalk as the officer roughly pushed him against the bus stop wall. The cold metal of handcuffs bit into his wrists as Barrett began reciting his rights, his voice carrying across the now silent street. More phones were recording now. Someone in the growing crowd shouted, "He's just a kid." Another voice called out, "This isn't right." But Officer Barrett seemed deaf to it all as he led Michael to his patrol car, ignoring the chess club logo on his jacket, ignoring the school books scattered from his fallen backpack, ignoring every sign that this was just a teenager waiting for his bus home. As Michael was placed in the back of the patrol car, he held on to one thought that gave him strength. His father would know what to do. What Officer Barrett didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. because Michael's father wasn't just any parent, and this wasn't going to be just another case of unfair treatment that would be swept under the rug. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Michael sat on a hard plastic chair, his wrists still bearing the marks from the handcuffs that had finally been removed. The booking area smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee, and occasional radio chatter broke through the tense silence. 2 desk officers kept glancing his way, their whispered conversations just out of earshot. Michael had remained silent during the entire ride to the station, remembering everything his parents had taught him about these situations. He'd asked once, calmly and clearly, for his phone call, and then focused on keeping his breathing steady. His chest training actually helped. It had taught him to think several moves ahead, to stay calm under pressure, and most importantly, to be patient. Officer Barrett was now at a desk across the room, typing furiously at his computer, probably trying to justify what had happened at the bus stop. Every few minutes, he would look up at Michael with an unreadable expression, then return to his typing with even more intensity. The officer's supervisor, Sergeant Chen, had already asked him twice to make sure everything in the report is absolutely accurate. A young officer who had been manning the front desk walked over to Michael, offering him a paper cup of water. There was something in her expression, concern, maybe even embarrassment, as she whispered, "Your parents have been notified. They're on their way." Michael nodded his thanks, noticing how her eyes lingered on his chest club jacket before she walked away. The station's front door swung open, letting in a burst of cool evening air. The click of dress shoes on the linoleum floor made Officer Barrett look up from his computer. His face suddenly went pale, and the typing stopped mid-sentence. A tall man in an impeccably tailored suit walked in, his presence immediately commanding attention. This was Anthony Richardson, but more importantly, this was Federal Judge Richardson, known throughout the state for his work on civil rights cases and police reform. And most importantly, this was Michael's father. But Judge Richardson didn't storm in shouting or demanding. He didn't need to. 25 years on the federal bench had taught him that real power doesn't need to raise its voice. He walked calmly to the front desk, his leather briefcase in one hand, and spoke in a measured tone that somehow carried throughout the entire room. "Good evening. I'm here for my son, Michael Richardson." He placed his credentials on the desk with deliberate care. "I believe he's being held without cause." The effect was immediate. Sergeant Chen, who had been in his office, practically sprinted to the front desk. Officer Barrett's face had gone from pale to ashen. The young officer who had given Michael water suddenly found a great interest in reorganizing files that didn't need reorganizing. "Judge Richardson," Sergeant Chen started, there seems to have been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," Judge Richardson repeated, his voice level but carrying a weight that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. "Would this misunderstanding have anything to do with my son being handcuffed at a public bus stop while wearing his chest club jacket and carrying his school books?" He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a tablet. "Or perhaps it has something to do with these videos that are already circulating on social media. The ones showing my son calmly asking to call his parents before being forcibly detained." The silence in the room was deafening. Officer Barrett had stopped pretending to type and was now staring at his screen, likely wondering how a routine patrol had gone so wrong. "I would like to see the arrest report," Judge Richardson continued, his calm voice somehow more intimidating than any shout could have been. "I'm particularly interested in the probable cause section. I'm also interested in reviewing Officer Barrett's body camera footage as well as his previous arrest records for this area. And I believe my son still hasn't been allowed his phone call." Sergeant Chen nodded quickly. "Of course, Your Honor, we'll get those right away, and naturally, we're releasing Michael immediately." But Judge Richardson wasn't finished. "This isn't going to be handled with a simple release and apology, Sergeant. What happened today is a symptom of a larger problem, one that I've seen far too often in my courtroom. But perhaps," he paused, looking thoughtfully at Officer Barrett, who seemed to be trying to disappear into his chair, "perhaps this can become an opportunity for real change." Michael watched his father with a mixture of pride and awe. This was why he had stayed so calm. He knew his father would handle this the right way. Not with threats or violence, but with the quiet, unstoppable force of justice itself. "Michael," his father called, finally turning to him, "are you ready to go home?" Your mother is waiting in the car, and I believe we have some important discussions ahead of us. Not just about what happened today, but about how we can make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else's child." As Michael stood up, straightening his chest club jacket, he noticed something interesting. Officer Barrett was looking at him differently now, not with the suspicion or authority he'd shown at the bus stop, but with something that looked a lot like shame. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of the change his father had mentioned. Walking out of the station with his father, Michael realized that sometimes the most powerful moves in life, like in chess, aren't the loud, aggressive ones. Sometimes the most powerful move is simply being exactly who you are, standing your ground with dignity and letting justice take its course. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of Judge Richardson's home office as he sat reviewing the footage from the previous day's incident. His wife Lisa, a civil rights attorney herself, stood behind his chair, watching the videos play out on his computer screen. Michael sat quietly on the leather couch nearby, doing his homework but occasionally glancing up at his parents' serious expressions. The judge's phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn. Local news stations had picked up the story, and social media was ablaze with the videos taken by witnesses. But unlike many similar incidents that had sparked outrage and faded away, this one was about to take a different turn. "We could file a lawsuit," Lisa said, placing a gentle hand on her husband's shoulder. With the footage and witnesses, it would be an easy win. But Judge Richardson slowly shook his head, his expression thoughtful as he paused the video. "You know what I see when I watch this?" he asked, turning to look at his son. "I see two people who both need help, but in very different ways. Michael, you handled yourself with incredible dignity. But Officer Barrett, he needs something more than punishment." Michael looked up from his textbook. "What do you mean, Dad?" The judge stood up and walked to his window, looking out at their peaceful suburban street. "Change doesn't always come from forcing people to their knees. Sometimes it comes from helping them stand up straighter." Just then, the doorbell rang. Lisa went to answer it, returning moments later with Police Chief Thompson, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too many incidents like this. But there was something else in those eyes today: determination. "Judge Richardson," she said, accepting his invitation to sit. "I've reviewed everything: the footage, Officer Barrett's record, the witness statements. But I'm here because I heard you might have a different approach in mind." The judge nodded, sharing a knowing look with his wife. "Chief, what if we could turn this incident into something that helps prevent the next one?" For the next hour, they talked about possibilities. Michael watched and listened as the adults in the room sketched out a plan that was about more than just one incident or one officer. His father pulled out statistics showing patterns that had been building for years. His mother added legal perspectives about policy changes that could make a real difference. Chief Thompson leaned forward in her chair, her expression growing more animated as they talked. "You're suggesting we use this as a catalyst for department-wide changes." "Exactly," Judge Richardson replied. "Instead of a lawsuit, we create a program. Officer Barrett becomes part of the solution, not just another example of the problem." But first, he turned to Michael. "Son, what do you think?" Michael closed his book and thought carefully before speaking. "At the bus stop, I was scared," he admitted. "But I was also sad. Sad that Officer Barrett couldn't see me for who I really was. If we can help officers see people better, really see them, maybe that's worth more than winning a lawsuit." The chief's eyes softened as she looked at Michael. "You know, in 20 years of police work, I've seen a lot of anger, justified anger. But what you're suggesting, this kind of wisdom from someone your age, it's exactly what we need more of." They spent the next few hours outlining a comprehensive plan. It would start with Officer Barrett, but it wouldn't end there. The program would include community engagement initiatives, bias training that went beyond the usual PowerPoint presentations, and real conversations between officers and the communities they served. As the sun began to set, Chief Thompson stood to leave, clutching a folder full of notes and proposals. "Judge Richardson, Mrs. Richardson, Michael," she paused, looking at each of them. "Thank you. This could have gone very differently. Most people would have wanted revenge. You're choosing to help us grow instead." After she left, Michael helped his mother prepare dinner while his father made some calls. The kitchen filled with the smell of his mother's famous lasagna as they talked about the day's events. "Mom," Michael asked as he grated cheese, "do do you think it'll really make a difference?" Lisa stopped stirring the sauce and turned to her son. "You know what's special about chess, Michael? It teaches you to think several moves ahead, to see patterns, to understand that every piece on the board has value. What your father proposed today is like that, seeing the whole board, not just one piece." Later that evening, as Michael got ready for bed, he overheard his father on the phone in his study. "Yes, Commissioner, I understand it's unusual, but sometimes the best solutions are the ones we haven't tried yet. Officer Barrett made a mistake, but mistakes can be turning points if we let them." Michael smiled as he climbed into bed. Tomorrow, he'd go back to school, back to chess club, back to his normal life. But something had changed. He'd learned that justice could wear many faces, and sometimes the quietest response could make the loudest impact. 1 week after the incident, the community center's main hall was packed with people. Folding chairs filled the space, and late arrivals stood along the walls. At the front of the room, Chief Thompson stood at a podium, with Judge Richardson and Michael seated nearby. But it was the person sitting alone in the front row who drew everyone's attention. Officer Barrett, in civilian clothes, looking both nervous and determined. The room buzzed with whispered conversations until the chief stepped up to speak. "We're here today," she began, her voice carrying to the back of the room, "because last week, something happened that could have torn our community apart. Instead, thanks to the wisdom of the Richardson family, we're using it to bring us together." In the audience, Michael noticed familiar faces, the woman who had recorded the incident, some of his chess club teammates, even the construction workers who had witnessed his arrest. But there were new faces too, police officers in uniform, community leaders, and local residents of all backgrounds. Chief Thompson continued, "Officer Barrett has something he'd like to say." The room fell silent as Barrett stood and walked to the podium. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the microphone. "I've been a police officer for 8 years," he started, his voice rough with emotion. "I told myself I was doing everything right, following procedures, keeping the community safe. But last week, I didn't keep anyone safe. I let my assumptions and biases cloud my judgment, and I hurt someone who was doing nothing wrong." He turned to look directly at Michael and his family. "I've spent the last week watching that body camera footage over and over. Each time, I see something new I did wrong. I see a kid wearing a chess club jacket, carrying school books, politely asking to call his parents. And I see myself completely failing to be the officer I promised to be when I took my oath." The room remained quiet, but the tension has shifted. This wasn't the defensive non-apology people had expected. This was something raw and real. "Judge Richardson could have ended my career," Barrett continued. "He had every right to. Instead, he asked me a question that's been keeping me up at night. He asked me, 'What kind of officer do you want to be remembered as?'" Barrett paused, taking a deep breath. "I've made my decision. I want to be part of the solution. That's why I volunteered to be part of this new community engagement program. I want to learn to grow, to do better. Not just for myself, but for every kid who looks like Michael, who deserves to wait for their bus without fear." As Barrett returned to his seat, Chief Thompson outlined the new program. It wasn't just about sensitivity training or cultural awareness workshops. It was about creating real connections between officers and the community they served. The first initiative would start next week. Officers would spend time at local schools, not as authority figures, but as mentors and chess partners. Michael's chess club had volunteered to help teach the basics to any officers willing to learn. "Chess teaches us to think before we move," Michael explained when the chief invited him to speak. His voice was clear and confident, drawing smiles from his parents. "It shows us that every piece on the board has value, and that one wrong move can change everything. But it also teaches us that mistakes aren't the end, they're opportunities to learn and play better next time." A young officer in the audience raised her hand. "I'd like to volunteer for the chess program," she said. Then another hand went up and another. Soon, a dozen officers had volunteered. After the meeting, people didn't rush to leave. They stayed, talking in small groups, sharing stories and contact information. Officer Barrett approached Michael and his parents, still looking nervous but standing straighter than before. "I was wondering," he said, "if you'd be willing to teach me chess. I've never played, but after hearing you talk about it, well, it seems like something I should learn." Michael looked at his parents, who nodded encouragingly. First lesson, Michael said with a small smile, every game starts with both sides equal. It's the choices we make that determine how things end up. As they left the community center that evening, Michael overheard two elderly residents talking. You know, one said to the other, I've lived here 40 years, seen a lot of problems come and go. But this feels different. Like maybe we're finally learning to play a better game. Walking to their car under the setting sun, Judge Richardson put his arm around his son's shoulders. You know, Michael, sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice isn't a lawsuit or a protest. Sometimes it's the willingness to see the humanity in everyone, even those who've wronged us, and to help them see it too. Michael nodded, thinking about the chess matches ahead, about Officer Barrett learning to play, about all the small moves that could lead to bigger changes. He realized that what had started as a frightening incident at a bus stop was becoming something else entirely. A chance to change not just one officer's perspective, but an entire community's approach to justice and understanding. 3 months had passed since the incident at the bus stop. The community center's activity room, once just a quiet space used for occasional meetings, now buzzed with the soft clicking of chess pieces and thoughtful conversation every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. Today was special, though. It was the first informal chess tournament between police officers and high school students. Officer Barrett sat across from Michael, his brow furrowed in concentration as he studied the board. He'd been practicing for weeks, often staying late after his shifts to play quick games with anyone willing to teach him something new. The change in him was visible to everyone. Gone was the rigid, suspicious officer who had made that wrongful arrest. In his place sat someone who had learned to think before moving, to consider all possibilities, to see the whole board. Check, Michael said quietly, moving his knight into position. Barrett smiled, not frustrated but appreciative of the clever move. Around them, other games were in progress. Officers paired with students, learning from each other, building bridges one chess match at a time. Chief Thompson watched from the doorway, a cup of coffee in her hand and a satisfied expression on her face. The program had exceeded her expectations. Complaints against officers had dropped by 30% in the past 3 months. More importantly, she was seeing a change in how her officers approached their daily interactions with the community. Amazing what can happen when you give people a chance to see each other as human beings, isn't it? Judge Richardson had joined her at the door, speaking softly so as not to disturb the players. You know, the chief replied, when you first proposed this instead of a lawsuit, I thought you were being too optimistic. But watching Officer Barrett today, he's become one of our best community liaisons. Other departments are starting to ask about our program. Near the window, a rookie officer was getting a chess lesson from one of Michael's chess club friends. So the pawn can only move forward, the student explained patiently, but it captures diagonally. Kind of like how things aren't always what they seem at first glance. The officer nodded thoughtfully. Like how we need to look at situations from different angles before making assumptions. The student grinned, pleased that the officer had caught the deeper meaning. Lisa Richardson, who had stopped by after court, stood watching her son's game with Barrett. 3 months ago, she had been ready to file a major lawsuit. Now she was watching her son teach chess to the same officer who had wrongfully arrested him. The irony wasn't lost on her, but neither was the beauty of the moment. Checkmate, Michael said finally, but his tone was friendly. Barrett laughed, shaking his head in admiration. You know, Barrett said, starting to reset the pieces, my daughter asked me to teach her chess last week. She's only 7, but she said she wants to learn because her dad's always talking about it now. Never thought I'd be that guy. Michael helped him set up the board for another game. My dad says chess is like life. It's not about winning or losing, it's about learning from every move. At a nearby table, 2 other officers were organizing next week's community youth basketball tournament, another initiative that had grown from the original program. The barrier between us and them was slowly dissolving, replaced by a sense of shared community. The local news had picked up the story too. A reporter stood in the corner with a camera, capturing footage for a piece about innovative community policing programs. But the real story wasn't in the shots of people playing chess or the statistics about reduced complaints. It was in the small moments. An officer and a teenager fist-pumping after a good move, a student teaching a police sergeant about chess strategy, the natural conversations flowing between moves. Later that evening, as people were packing up to leave, Officer Barrett pulled Judge Richardson aside. "Your son," he said, gesturing toward Michael, who was helping clean up, "he's taught me more than just chess. He's taught me how to be a better officer, a better person. I don't think I'll ever be able to fully make up for what I did that day at the bus stop, but—" The judge interrupted him gently. "The point was never to make up for it, Officer Barrett. The point was to grow from it. And from where I'm standing, you've done exactly that." As Michael walked out with his parents that evening, he passed the community center's bulletin board. Next to the chess club tournament schedule was a new poster announcing the police department's updated community engagement initiatives. At the bottom was a quote that made him smile. "Every piece on the board has value. Every person in our community matters." His mother noticed his smile. "Penny for your thoughts." Michael looked at her, then back at the center where Officer Barrett was helping stack chairs. "I was just thinking, sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes if we let them." His father squeezed his shoulder proudly. "And sometimes the best teachers are the ones who started out as opponents." In the parking lot, they could still hear the cheerful voices of officers and students making plans for next week's matches. What had started as a response to an injustice had grown into something much more, a testament to the power of choosing understanding over anger, growth over punishment, and hope over fear. 6 months after the incident that had changed everything, the local convention center was filled to capacity. Police chiefs and community leaders from across the state had gathered to learn about what the media was calling the Richardson method, turning potential conflicts into opportunities for growth. Michael stood backstage, adjusting his tie nervously. In a few minutes, he would be speaking to hundreds of people about his experience. His father had told him he didn't have to do this, but Michael knew his story could help other communities make similar changes. Officer Barrett stood nearby, also looking slightly nervous in his dress uniform. "Ready?" he asked Michael with an encouraging smile. It was still amazing how their relationship had transformed from that tense moment at the bus stop to this partnership in positive change. As they waited, Michael thought back to all that had happened in the past few months. The chess program had expanded to 5 community centers across the city. Crime rates had dropped, not because of aggressive policing, but because officers and community members had learned to work together to understand each other better. Chief Thompson stepped up to the podium to begin the presentation. "6 months ago," she started, "our department faced a crisis. An innocent young man was wrongfully arrested, and we had a choice to make. We could have followed the usual script: denial, defensive statements, minimal changes. Instead, thanks to the wisdom of Judge Richardson and his family, we chose a different path." The screen behind her showed photos from the chess program, the community basketball tournaments, and other initiatives that had grown from that initial idea. "But I'm not here to take credit," she continued. "I'd like to introduce you to the real architects of change, Michael Richardson and Officer Robert Barrett." As Michael walked onto the stage with Officer Barrett, the applause was warm and genuine. He looked out at the sea of faces, police officers, community leaders, ordinary citizens, all eager to learn how they could create similar changes in their own communities. "My story starts at a bus stop," Michael began, his voice clear and confident. "I was just a kid waiting to go home after chess club. Officer Barrett was just doing his job, or at least, that's what he thought at the time. What happened next could have been another sad headline, another reason for anger and division. Instead, it became something else entirely." Officer Barrett stepped forward to share his part. "I had been a police officer for 8 years, he said, "and I thought I knew everything about protecting and serving. But I had forgotten the most important part, seeing the humanity in every person I encountered. It took a 16-year-old chess player to teach me that lesson." Together, they explained how the chess program had worked, how it had broken down barriers and built understanding. They showed videos of officers and teenagers teaching each other, sharing stories and laughter over chessboards. But more importantly, they shared the statistics that proved the program's success. Complaints against officers down by 40%, Chief Thompson reported. Community trust up by 60%. Crime rates dropping not because of harsh enforcement, but because of better understanding between police and the community. A police chief from another city raised his hand. "This is impressive, but surely it can't work everywhere? Some communities have deeper problems, longer histories of distrust." Michael smiled at this question. He had expected it. That's exactly why it can work anywhere, he replied. Chess teaches us that every game starts fresh. The mistakes of the past don't determine the moves we make today. What matters is our willingness to learn, to change, to see things from new perspectives. Officer Barrett added, 6 months ago, I would have agreed with you. I would have said some problems are too big to solve with games and conversation. But look at this. He gestured to a recent photo of himself teaching chess to a group of kids at a local school. These children don't see a uniform anymore. They see someone who cares enough to learn their names, to understand their challenges, to be part of their community. During the lunch break, Michael watched as police chiefs and community leaders exchanged contact information, eager to start similar programs in their own cities. His father joined him, placing a proud hand on his shoulder. You know what the best part is? Judge Richardson said, watching the crowd. This isn't just about chess anymore. It's about remembering that change is possible, that people can grow, that communities can heal. A young officer from another department approached them. Your speech was amazing, she told Michael. But I have to ask, how did you find the strength to forgive? To turn such a negative experience into something positive? Michael thought carefully before answering. I didn't do it alone, he said, glancing at his father. And it wasn't about forgiveness as much as it was about choosing what kind of future we wanted to build. Every time I teach someone chess, I remind them that each move has consequences. But I also remind them that every game is a chance to play better, to be better. As the day wound down, Chief Thompson announced one final surprise. The department had created a new position, Community Relations Director, and had asked Officer Barrett to take the role. His first task would be helping other departments implement similar programs. 6 months ago, Barrett said in his acceptance speech, I made a mistake that could have ended my career. Instead, it became the beginning of the most important work I've ever done. We're not just playing chess here, we're building bridges, one move at a time. Later that evening, as Michael packed up his demonstration chess set, a reporter asked him what he hoped would come from the conference. Michael looked around the room, at all the people taking notes, making plans, ready to create change in their own communities. I hope they remember that big changes start with small moves, he said, that sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to step back, think carefully, and be willing to see things from the other person's side of the board. 1 year after the incident at the bus stop, the city park was alive with activity. Colorful banners hung between trees announcing the first annual Community Unity Festival. Chess tables were set up under shady spots, alongside basketball courts where officers and teenagers played friendly games. The smell of barbecue filled the air, and laughter echoed across the grounds. Michael stood near the Central Chess Pavilion, now a high school senior preparing for college. He watched as Officer Barrett, in casual clothes rather than his uniform, taught a group of young kids the basics of chess. The sight still amazed him, how a moment that could have torn the community apart had instead brought it together in ways no one could have imagined. Remember, Barrett was saying to his young students, every piece on the board has its own way of moving, its own strength, just like every person in our community has their own story, their own value. The children nodded, completely at ease with the man who had become one of the most respected figures in community policing. Chief Thompson walked through the crowd, stopping to chat with families and officers alike. The changes in the police department had exceeded everyone's expectations. 20 other cities had already adopted similar programs, and the results were promising everywhere. You know, the chief said, joining Michael at the chess pavilion, we just got the latest statistics. Complaints against officers are down by 70% compared to last year. But here's the really interesting part. Officer job satisfaction is up by 60%. Turns out, building bridges is more rewarding than building walls. Michael's father arrived with a group of judges and city officials from other states, all eager to see the program in action. This is where it all started, Judge Richardson told them, gesturing to his son. One incident that could have been just another tragedy became the spark for real change. A small crowd had gathered to play speed chess, with officers and community members paired up randomly, sharing stories between moves. The old barriers of mistrust had melted away, replaced by genuine connections and understanding. Your move, said a rookie officer to her teenage opponent, their game drawing a small audience. But think carefully, like Officer Barrett always says, every move affects the whole board. Michael smiled at how his chess club metaphors had become common wisdom in the department. Even officers who had never played chess before the program started were now using these ideas in their daily work. Near the basketball courts, Barrett's daughter was playing with other kids, wearing a t-shirt that read Community Unity Champion. Her father's transformation had influenced not just his work, but his entire family's connection to the community. A local reporter who had covered the original incident approached Michael. "1 year later," she said, "what's the biggest change you've seen?" Michael thought for a moment, watching the scene around him. "Look there," he said, pointing to where a group of officers were helping some kids set up a chessboard. A year ago, those kids might have been scared if officers approached them. Now they're asking officers to teach them new moves. The fear is gone, replaced by trust. The reporter nodded, taking notes. "And Officer Barrett? Did you ever imagine he'd become the face of community policing reform?" "That's the beauty of it," Michael replied. "When you give people the chance to learn and grow, they often surprise you." Officer Barrett didn't just change, he helped change the whole system. As the afternoon sun began to set, families spread blankets on the grass for a community picnic. Officers and residents shared food and stories, while kids ran around playing tag. The wall that had once divided the police from the community had become a bridge. Judge Richardson stood up to make a brief speech. "1 year ago," he began, "my son was wrongfully arrested at a bus stop. Today, we're not celebrating that incident. We're celebrating what grew from it, a new way of thinking about community and justice. We're celebrating the courage to change, the wisdom to learn from mistakes, and the power of seeing each other's humanity." Officer Barrett joined them, his daughter perched on his shoulders. "You know what the best part is?" he said to Michael. "My daughter won't grow up seeing a divide between police and community. For her, this is just normal, people working together, understanding each other, making things better." The chess pavilion had quieted as the sun set, but one last game was finishing up. A young officer and a teenage girl were in the final moves, both smiling despite the intensity of their game. "Checkmate," the girl said finally, and they shook hands, already making plans to play again next week. Michael packed up the last chess set, reflecting on how far they'd come. The incident that could have been just another sad statistic had instead sparked a movement. Other cities were calling it a miracle, but Michael knew better. It wasn't a miracle. It was what happened when people chose understanding over anger, growth over punishment, and hope over fear. As families headed home and the cleanup crew began their work, Michael's mother put her arm around his shoulders. "Proud of you, kid," she said simply. Michael looked around at the park one last time, at Officer Barrett helping his daughter collect chess pieces, at the chief chatting with community members, at the teenagers and officers exchanging phone numbers to arrange next week's basketball game. "You know what, Mom?" he replied. "I'm proud of all of us. We didn't just change a system, we changed hearts. And that's a game everybody wins."